A casually dressed man walks into a Ferrari showroom, only to be mocked by a salesman who assumes he can't afford anything there. Moments later, the dealer is stunned to realize the nobody he laughed at is actually Keanu Reeves, a world-famous actor who could buy any car he wants. The incident becomes a lesson in never judging someone's worth by their clothes or appearance. Sometimes life tests people in places where everything looks perfect from the outside. This story starts in a showroom full of polished metal and glass, where one man walks in dressed like he just got off a long bus ride, not like someone ready to buy a Ferrari. The afternoon sun was slipping behind the buildings when he pushed open the heavy glass door. His black jacket was faded at the elbows, his boots dusty from the street, a worn backpack hanging from one shoulder. He smelled faintly of gasoline and rain, the kind of scent that comes from old motorcycles and long roads. No one at the front desk looked up right away. In a temple of luxury like this, noise didn't come from engines, it came from money. He paused just inside, taking in the line of red Ferraris under the showroom lights. Their bodies glowed like they were lit from the inside, every curve sharpened by reflections of the marble floor. For a second he looked honestly childlike, eyes soft, shoulders relaxed, as if he'd stepped into a dream he'd had since he was 16 and broke and riding a beat-up bike to his first job. He lifted a hand and brushed his fingers along the air above a bright red hood, careful not to touch. Near the reception desk, a salesman in a tailored gray suit noticed him at last. The man's name tag read Vince, but his eyes said something else, calculation. He took in the stranger's scuffed boots, the unshaved jaw, the simple black T-shirt with a tiny hole near the hem. Vince's mouth twitched into a smirk. He straightened his red tie, shot a quick look at his coworker across the room, and both of them shared the silent laugh of men who believed they already knew exactly who they were dealing with. "Hey, buddy," Vince called out, that fake-friendly tone people use when they've already decided they're above you. "You lost. Bathrooms are in the back. Test drives are well." He let the sentence hang there as his eyes slid slowly from the backpack to the boots. "You probably just want some pictures with the cars, right?" He chuckled, loud enough for the others to hear. "No touching, though. These beauties cost more than that jacket." The man turned toward him, confusion flickering across his face for a second before he smoothed it away. There was something disarming in his expression, a quiet patience that didn't quite match the roughness of his clothes. "Actually," he said calmly, "I was hoping to ask a few questions about that one." He nodded toward a dark red Ferrari in the center of the room, its paint almost the color of dried blood under the white lights. His voice was gentle, almost apologetic, as if he were the one intruding. Across the showroom, a young woman behind a computer screen looked up from her work. Her name was Alina, a new hire who still carried a small notebook where she wrote down what she learned about engines and clients. She saw the way Vince laughed, saw the stranger's easy posture stiffen just a little, and something inside her tightened. She recognized that look, the small, invisible cut of being judged before you've said 3 sentences. She'd seen it on her father's face when he came home from construction sites, dust in his hair and stories he didn't want to tell. Vince walked closer, his shoes clicking sharply on the floor. "Questions?" he repeated as if the word itself was amusing. "Sure, man, but just so you know, this isn't a rental shop. People who come here usually talk to their banks before they talk to me." He laughed again, then added under his breath, not quite low enough, "Backpackers don't usually drive Ferraris." The man's eyes darkened for a heartbeat. He could have answered that laugh in a dozen different ways. He could have pulled out his phone, opened a browser, and shown this salesman exactly how wrong he was. He could have flashed a card that opens doors in every luxury showroom on earth. He could have simply said his name. Instead, he took a slow breath, letting the insult settle deep, and remembered who he used to be, a kid riding the bus, counting coins, wearing the same shoes until the soles broke open. People had laughed at him then, too. The difference now was that he had nothing left to prove. Alina shifted in her chair, torn between fear and anger. She knew Vince closed the biggest deals in the showroom. He drove a company Porsche, had his own office, and liked to remind everyone that he understood real clients. Speaking up against him could make her first job in years disappear in a single afternoon. But watching the stranger stand there with that quiet, tired dignity, she felt her hands clench into fists beneath the desk. The showroom suddenly felt colder, the shine of the cars a little emptier. "So," Vince said, clapping his hands together as if ending a joke, "what do you say I take a couple of photos of you in front of the car? Free souvenir. Then you can, tell your friends you were here." His smile was wide, but there was no kindness in it. Man didn't move. For a long moment, the only sounds were the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant echo of a television in the waiting lounge. Then he looked straight at Vince, not angry, not smiling, just very present. "You're right about one thing," he said quietly. "I don't look like I belong here." His hand went to the strap of his backpack, fingers tightening. "But what if I told you?" He paused, something complicated passing through his eyes, hurt, amusement, a bit of old pain. "What if I told you I'm not here to buy a car for myself at all?" The words hung in the air between them, shifting the energy of the whole room. Elena felt her heart jump. Vince's smirk faltered for the first time, and somewhere behind the glass wall, the manager's office door began to open. The manager stepped out of his office, adjusting his cufflinks as if he were walking onto a stage. His name was Marco, a man in his 50s with silver at his temples and the tired eyes of someone who had spent too many years turning dreams into payments. He had heard Vince's laughter through the glass, and more importantly, had noticed the way the stranger stood, calm, centered, not shrinking even when mocked. It was a posture he'd seen before on people who were used to being watched. "Is there a problem here?" Marco asked, his voice smooth but firm. Vince's back straightened. "No problem at all, boss. Just helping our friend here take a look around. He cleared his throat. "He says he's not even buying for himself." The sarcasm crept back into his tone, thin but sharp. "Maybe he wants a keychain." The man with the backpack glanced at Elena, who was watching from behind her computer, caught between wanting to disappear and wanting to stand between them like a shield. He could see the discomfort in her eyes, the quiet apology she didn't dare say out loud. For the first time since he'd walked in, he smiled. It was small, but it reached his eyes, softening the tension. "I'd like to buy a car," he said, turning back to Marco. "A Ferrari, cash today." He let the words land one by one, not bragging, just stating a fact. "But you're right, it isn't for me." He looked past the rows of cars as if he could see through the walls and miles beyond. "It's for someone who thinks this is impossible." The room shifted. Even Vince's confidence cracked for a moment. People who asked for discounts did not usually say cash like that. Elena felt goosebumps rise on her arms. She leaned forward slightly, curiosity pulling her closer. Marco watched the stranger's face, that strange combination of gentleness and old scars. He had spent years reading people, the rich, the pretenders, the ones who just wanted a photo. This man didn't fit. "Who is it for?" Elena blurted before she could stop herself. His eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her instantly regret and then instantly treasure the question. Pain and love tangled together. "For a mechanic," he said quietly. "A kid who fixes other people's dreams with hands that have never touched his own." He swallowed. "He helped me once, a long time ago. Now it's my turn." Vince snorted, trying to recover his lost authority. "A mechanic," he repeated. "Right, and I'm the Pope. Look, man, we get guys like you all the time. Big stories, no wallet, don't waste the manager's time. These cars aren't charity projects." The insult hit harder this time, not because of the words, but because of who they were aimed at. The mechanic in his memory had grease on his nails and hunger in his eyes, but kindness in his hands. The stranger's jaw tightened. Elena saw his knuckles go white around the strap of his backpack. Marco opened his mouth to smooth things over, but the man spoke first. "You're right about one thing," he said, voice low but steady. "These cars aren't charity, they're symbols. People worship them. They think they mean success or power, but they're just machines." He glanced at the red Ferrari in the center. "What matters is what you do with the power you have, who you help with it." Silence settled over the showroom. Even the faint murmur from the waiting lounge seemed to fade. Elena felt her throat tighten. This didn't sound like someone pretending. It sounded like someone who had carried heavy things for a long time. "Look," Marco said carefully, "if you're serious about a purchase, we can." The man slowly unzipped his backpack. Vince rolled his eyes, already picturing a cheap wallet, maybe a handful of crumpled bills. But when the zipper opened, there was no wallet, no nervous fumbling. Instead, there was a thick, neatly folded envelope. The stranger pulled it out and placed it gently on the glossy hood of the nearest car, ignoring Vince's gasp of horror at the casual disrespect. He slid the envelope toward Marco. "Start with this," he said. "If it's not enough for that model," he nodded toward the dark red Ferrari on the raised platform, "tell me and I'll figure something out." Marco hesitated, then opened the envelope. His breath caught. Inside, stacked like pressed snow, were bank drafts and certified checks, each with more zeros than most people would see in a lifetime. Elena watched Marco's hands tremble almost imperceptibly as he flipped through them. Vince took a step closer, his smirk dissolving into open-mouthed silence. The stranger didn't look at the money. His gaze had gone far away again, back to another garage, another life. "A few years ago," he said softly, "my bike broke down outside a tiny repair shop at midnight. I had nowhere to be, but somehow I still felt like I was late for something important. A kid opened up the shop just for me. Wouldn't let me pay the full price. Said he knew what it meant to be stuck with no ride, no backup plan." Elena could see it now, the scene playing out in her mind like a movie. The man on a dark street, the fluorescent flicker of a cheap garage sign, the young mechanic wiping sweat and oil from his forehead, refusing extra cash. "And now?" she asked, unable to help herself. "Now," he answered, eyes glistening with old gratitude. "He doesn't know that the bike he fixed carried me to one of the most important nights of my life. He has no idea what that kindness did. I owe him more than a thank you." Marco looked up from the envelope, his eyes wide, a question forming on his lips. Vince seemed suddenly smaller, standing there with his perfect suit and ruined certainty. The stranger drew a slow breath, as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff and deciding whether to jump. Marco studied him one more time, then narrowed his eyes, recognition creeping in. "Forgive me if this sounds strange," he said carefully, "but have we seen you before?" The stranger's shoulders tensed. For the first time since he'd entered, a flicker of discomfort flashed across his face, as if he were caught between disappearing and being seen too clearly. He met Marco's gaze, and something in the air changed, as if a curtain were about to be pulled back in front of the entire showroom. The memory hit him so hard he could almost smell the oil again. The garage had been small, squeezed between a laundromat and a cheap diner, the kind of place where people brought cars that other shops had already given up on. Neon buzzed over the open bay door. The night air was cold, sharp enough to cut through his jacket as he pushed the heavy motorcycle the last few meters, lungs burning, knees aching. He had just left a set that could change everything for him, a role that might finally drag him out of the cramped apartments and second-hand furniture. Then the bike coughed once and died. A skinny kid in a faded blue jumpsuit had stepped out, rubbing sleep from his eyes, hair still damp from a rushed shower. "We're closed, man," he'd said, but there was no hostility in it, just exhaustion. Then he'd seen the way the stranger leaned on the bike, shoulders sagging, and something in his expression softened. "But let me take a look." He worked in silence at first, hands moving quickly, tools clinking softly in the night. Up close, the stranger had noticed the details, the taped corner of the kid's shoe, the cheap watch with a cracked face, the calluses that came from years of hard work, not luxury gym sessions. There'd been old music playing from a dusty radio, Spanish ballads about heartbreak and hope. When the kid caught him listening, he'd grinned shyly. "My mom's playlist," he'd explained. "Helps me stay awake." An hour later, the motorcycle came back to life with a roar that echoed off the alley walls. The stranger had felt something in his chest roar awake with it. This wasn't just about a bike. Somehow, this was about not being stranded, in life, in dreams, in the middle of nowhere with no one willing to help. He offered double the price, pushing crumpled bills toward the kid. The mechanic had frowned and pushed half of them back. "No way," he'd said. "You look like you're chasing something important. Take the rest. Buy yourself dinner or coffee or new boots." He'd smiled, quick and genuine. "Just when it works out for you, you help somebody else, yeah, that's how it goes." Back in the bright Ferrari showroom, the stranger blinked, pulled out of the past by the weight of Marco's stare. "You remind me of someone," the manager said slowly. "Someone my son watches in movies. The walk, the eyes," he hesitated, as if he were afraid to say the thought out loud and be wrong. Elena looked carefully at the man's face now, really looked. There was a familiarity there she hadn't allowed herself to process, hidden behind the scruffy hair and simple clothes. Her heart began to pound. She whispered a name under her breath, barely audible even to herself, and felt a shock of disbelief. No, it couldn't be. Not here. Not like this. The stranger saw recognition flickering around the room like sparks looking for dry grass. His instinct screamed to shut it down, to laugh it off, to walk away and find some anonymous dealership where nobody cared who he was as long as his money was real. Fame had given him more than he ever dared want, but it had also taken from him the quiet things, like being able to buy a gift without turning it into a show. He looked at the envelope on the hood, then at Alina, who was watching him not with hunger but with a strange, protective worry, as if she already knew what this revelation might unleash. For a moment he considered lying, telling Marco that he just got that a lot, shrugging off the connection. But then he thought of the kid in the garage, of the way he had said, when it works out for you, you help somebody else. That promise felt heavier now than any movie contract. Maybe you have, he said quietly. Maybe you haven't. He gave a crooked, almost shy smile. Either way, today I'm just a man trying to keep a promise. Marco's brow furrowed. He glanced down at the checks again, then back at the stranger's face. The puzzle pieces began to slide into place. He turned his head slightly, catching the reflection of the man in the showroom glass. There it was, the jawline from 100 posters, the eyes from 1,000 interviews, stripped of red carpets and designer suits. Alina's hand flew to her mouth. She didn't say the name, but it blazed in her mind. She'd seen this man give away his seat on a packed train in a grainy video, had watched an interview where he talked about grief and kindness with an honesty that had made her cry alone in her small apartment. And here he was, in front of her, being treated like he was nothing because his jacket was worn and his boots were dusty. Vince, still trying to salvage his pride, laughed nervously. "Come on, boss," he said. "You're not actually considering this. If he was really who you're thinking, he wouldn't walk in here looking like a person," the stranger finished, his voice suddenly sharper. He turned to Vince, not cruel but unflinchingly honest. "You saw my clothes and decided everything about me in 10 seconds. How many other people have you done that to? How many dreams did you laugh at because they didn't look expensive enough?" Vince opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, he had no ready answer, no polished comeback. The silence pressed on him from all sides, heavy and accusing. Marco straightened, decision hardening in his features. He placed the envelope gently back on the hood and stepped closer to the stranger. "Sir," he said, voice low, "if you are who I think you are, this dealership would be honored to—" "I don't want special treatment," the man interrupted, almost pleading. "I don't want cameras, I don't want a PR stunt, I just want that car." He pointed again at the dark red Ferrari. "And I want it delivered tonight before midnight to a small garage 3 hours from here." Alina leaned forward. "That's a long drive," she murmured. "I've done longer for less important reasons," he replied. His eyes met hers again, warm and steady. "And I won't ask you to believe anything about who I am, but believe this. The kid who's getting that car earned it with kindness he never expected to be repaid." Marco looked torn, trying to balance business, reputation, and the suddenly fragile ego of his top salesman. Vince shifted his weight, face pale, eyes searching desperately for a way to rewind the entire last 10 minutes. The stranger took a slow breath, then added softly, "And if we're going to do this, I'd like her to handle the paperwork." He nodded toward Alina. "She looked at me like a human being first." The words landed between them like a quiet explosion. Vince turned to stare at Alina, shock and jealousy colliding on his face. She felt heat rush to her cheeks, a mixture of pride, fear, and a strange new courage rising in her chest. Marco followed the stranger's gaze, then gave a small nod. "Alina," he said carefully, "why don't you show our guest to the lounge and start the process?" His eyes flicked to Vince. "We'll talk later." The air crackled with unspoken consequences. Vince's jaw clenched. Alina stepped out from behind her desk, heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. As she approached the stranger, she saw the hint of a grateful smile tug at his lips. "Thank you," he murmured. "For what?" she asked, voice barely steady. "For seeing me," he said, "before you saw everything else." She swallowed hard and gestured toward the glass-walled lounge. "This way, sir." As they walked past the gleaming cars, Vince stared after them, his mind racing through the last few minutes like a bad replay he couldn't escape. Behind him, Marco picked up the envelope again, his eyes lingering on the name printed on one of the checks, a name that made his breath catch in his throat and confirmed every wild suspicion at once. He looked up at the lounge, where the stranger was taking a seat beside Alina, and realized that whatever happened next would not just change their commission sheets. It would change the entire story this dealership told about itself. The lounge felt suddenly too small, the glass walls turning it into a stage neither of them had asked for. Outside, salesmen pretended to shuffle papers and check tablets, but their eyes kept drifting toward the man in the worn black jacket and the young woman sitting across from him with a stack of forms she could barely feel in her shaking hands. Alina laid the paperwork on the low table, trying to breathe normally. Up close, without the distance of a screen, he looked both exactly like himself and completely different. There were faint lines at the corners of his eyes that no movie poster ever showed, a quiet sadness that made his smiles, when they came, feel twice as precious. "I'm sorry about all of that," she said softly, nodding toward the showroom where Vince paced like a trapped animal. "He shouldn't have spoken to you that way, to anyone that way." He shrugged lightly. "I've heard worse, and to be fair, I did walk in looking like I just lost a fight with a freeway." A small laugh escaped him, easing the tension for a moment. "But you didn't laugh. That matters more than you think." She met his gaze. "I grew up watching my father come home from work in clothes people judged before they ever met him," she said. "Dust on his boots, paint on his hands. Hard work doesn't always look shiny." Her eyes flicked toward the red cars. "Sometimes it looks exactly the opposite." He listened, really listened, and she felt it. "What does he do?" he asked. "Construction," she answered. "Repairs mostly. Old buildings no one wants to invest in. He fixes things and gets paid just enough to break even." She hesitated, then added, "And I'm just trying to get us somewhere better." He shook his head gently. "Not just. You're here, you're learning, you're speaking up even when it's risky. That's not nothing." His gaze dropped to the forms between them. "You said you're new here." 3 weeks, she admitted. "I still get nervous printing contracts." She gave a tiny, self-conscious laugh. "And now the first big client I get to handle is you." He smiled again, softer this time. "Then we'll learn together. I can handle stunt driving on camera, but these forms scare me too." Her eyes widened. It was the first time he'd acknowledged openly what both of them already knew. "So you're really." He held up a hand, kind but firm. "Off the record, today I'm just a guy named Keanu doing something he should have done a long time ago." There was a weight in his tone that made the name feel less like a celebrity label and more like a simple truth. Out in the showroom, Marco approached the glass, the envelope of checks clutched like something sacred. He watched them together, the famous man speaking quietly, the young employee nodding, pen in hand. He thought about his own son, posters on the wall, headphones on, watching interviews of this same face talking about grief and generosity. If any of this made it online, the dealership would explode with attention. But watching the way Keanu sat, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes tired but kind, Marco knew exploiting that was the worst thing he could do. He turned away, crossing the floor until he reached Vince, who was staring at his reflection in the polished black hood of a Ferrari, expression hollow. "Office," Marco said quietly. "Now." Inside the office, the door clicked shut behind them. The sound felt final. "Boss, I didn't know," Vince blurted. "If I had known who he was." "That's the problem," Marco cut in. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a sharp edge. "You would have treated him differently only because of who he is. Tell me, Vince, if those checks had bounced, would his name have made them real?" Vince looked away, jaw working. "You hired me to read people, to protect the brand. We can't have every guy with a backpack sitting in a Ferrari and wasting our—" "You humiliated a client on the floor," Marco said, each word landing heavy. "You humiliated a human being in front of my staff, in front of someone who has spent his life." He stopped himself, drawing a slow breath. "In front of someone whose story will not stay inside these walls. You understand that, right?" Vince swallowed, the reality finally sinking in. Every sarcastic word, every mocking laugh, any one of them could become a headline by morning. His career, the one he'd built on polished smiles and clever pitches, hung by a thread woven from someone else's mercy. In the lounge, Alina slid the last form toward Keanu. "Just your signature here," she said, her voice steadier now. "This confirms the purchase, delivery details, and that you understand the risk of driving a car like this 3 hours tonight." He read the lines carefully and signed, the pen moving with deliberate strokes. "I understand," he said. "It's not my first fast ride." Her curiosity broke through her professional mask. "Why tonight?" she asked. "You could have them deliver it tomorrow or next week. Why drive 3 hours in the dark just to drop off a car?" He leaned back, eyes drifting to the ceiling for a moment. "Because sometimes," he answered quietly, "the timing is the gift. That kid in the garage, he works late. I know that. I want him to close up shop tonight thinking it's just another long, hard day. And then I want him to step outside and have his whole idea of what's possible implode in front of him." Alina felt a lump form in her throat. She pictured the young mechanic wiping his hands on a rag, switching off the lights, stepping into the cool night, and finding a dark red Ferrari waiting like a spaceship dropped from another universe. "You're not just buying him a car," she said softly. "You're buying him a new story about his life." He looked at her, impressed by the way she understood. "Yeah," he murmured, "maybe I'm also finishing an old chapter of mine." She hesitated, then took a breath that felt like a small act of rebellion. "Can I ask you something personal?" He nodded. "You can ask. I can't promise I'll answer." "Why didn't you just tell Vince your name the second he laughed?" she asked. "Most people would, just to shut him up." Keanu considered that for a long beat. "Because then he'd learn the wrong lesson," he said finally. "He'd think the mistake was not recognizing me. The real problem is thinking you can measure someone's worth by their shoes, or their jacket, or their bank account." She absorbed that in silence. It hit closer than he could know. Her own family had been measured by the stains on their clothes more times than she could count. "And what about your lesson?" she asked gently. "What are you supposed to learn today?" He gave a small, almost embarrassed laugh. "That I waited too long to go back," he admitted. "That sometimes, even when life beats you up and takes your privacy and throws you in front of cameras, you have to remember the midnight garage where everything started to turn, and honor it before it becomes just another good intention you never followed through on." Before she could respond, the lounge door opened. Marco stepped in, careful, respectful, closing it softly behind him. His eyes met Keanu's, and for a moment the two men simply regarded each other, one carrying decades of movies and headlines on his shoulders, the other carrying the weight of a business, a staff, and now a very public mistake. "Mr. Reeves," Marco began, tasting the name like a responsibility. "First, let me say, we are deeply grateful you chose our dealership for something this important." He swallowed. "And we are equally ashamed of how you were treated when you arrived." Keanu watched him, expression unreadable. Alina held her breath. Marco went on, "I can't change those first minutes, but I'd like to ask you something, not as a businessman, but as a father." His voice wavered slightly. "Please don't judge all of us by one man's arrogance, and please let me show you that we can do better." Silence hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Keanu glanced at Alina, then at the forms signed neatly on the table, then back at Marco. Somewhere in the main showroom, an engine turned over as a mechanic moved a car, the low growl punctuating the tension like a question mark. "I don't want anyone fired over me," Keanu said at last, his voice calm but firm. "That's not the point of this." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "But if you really want to make it right, there is something you could do." Marco's heart kicked. "Anything within my power," he said. Keanu's gaze hardened with sudden clarity. "Promise me this dealership will start a fund," he said. "Scholarships, training, something real for kids who fix cars in tiny garages and think they'll never escape them, for mechanics like the one I'm driving to tonight. I'll cover the first year myself. After that, it's on you." Alina's eyes widened. Marco stared, stunned. This was more than a car purchase now. It was an invitation to become part of something larger. "And one more thing," Keanu added, a hint of mischief lighting his face for the first time. "I want him," he nodded toward the glass where Vince sat in the office, head in his hands, "to help deliver the car with me if he's willing." The room went still. Elena's breath caught. Marco's eyes darted to the office, then back. Of all the conditions he'd expected, this was not one of them. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words tangled in his throat. Because out there, on the other side of the glass, Vince had just looked up, meeting Keanu's gaze through the reflection, and realizing with a stunned jolt that his future might depend on whether he had the courage to walk back into the presence of the man he'd laughed at and face the road ahead literally.